Step into realms where the heart takes flight, where strategy meets the edge of night. The Dungeons, Dragons, and Psychology Podcast. Prepare your mind. Now be our guest.
Hello and welcome to the Dungeons, Dragons, and Psychology Podcast. I am Robert Walker, your host, and with me again this week is my good buddy, Dustin Archer. Welcome back, Dustin.
Hello, everyone.
So last time we talked about building backwards, coming up with a big problem or a main idea where your campaign's going to end, and then jumping back to the beginning. And the reason we want to do that first is because today we're talking about foreshadowing. And in order to foreshadow properly from the beginning of your game, you have to have something that you're foreshadowing about.
Exactly.
So if you haven't checked out the episode on building backwards, I strongly recommend you check that one out first and then come back and check this one out. And we're going to get into it right now. Dustin, foreshadowing. What are some of your favorite moments of foreshadowing that have taken place in games you've been in?
Oh my gosh, it's so hard because every good game is entirely a good game, really, because of the moments and the dramatic reveals that were possible because of foreshadowing. You put me on the spot here, though. I'm trying to think of a specific foreshadowing instance that.
Well, you've definitely got some stuff going on in the game you're running right now. I know you've mentioned to me you foreshadowed some stuff early on that we don't know about. So spoil the game for me and tell me what my character needs to do.
Oh, don't you wish? I put too much into it for just that. But well, I'll give you the example that's already started to be revealed. You know, at the very beginning of the game, there was a girl that went missing. Her parents murdered, and the city guard is perplexed. Well, that girl in this game I'm running in the Tola setting is incredibly instrumental to the overarching plot in a way that doesn't have any. There's no real foreshadowing of that other than this girl was kidnapped, apparently you've recently learned, and who kidnapped her and why is only just barely becoming revealed to the party. But as the story continues, you'll continue to realize her importance in the overarching story, why she was kidnapped, what they wanted out of her, and that kind of thing. I'm not going to spoil those for you now, but I will tell you that because in the session 1 of that game, I alluded to this girl and told this story when you guys didn't realize the importance, and now you're starting to realize, oh my gosh, this enemy's had her for at least 2 months. What have they done? What's been going on? You're invested. And now I can use that. And as the party learns her importance, she becomes a meaningful character, a meaningful NPC that isn't just discounted and dismissed.
So in your opinion, how soon should foreshadowing begin?
At the beginning of session 1, when the players are first introducing themselves and they're getting familiar, they're describing this is what my character looks like, they're establishing backstories, you are laying out the initial flavor of the campaign, the feel, the tone. I mean, you're basically in session 1 really revealing, is this a gothic horror campaign? Is this an urban adventure? Is this a wilderness, kind of a frontier type thing? When you're doing that is the perfect time to foreshadow because the party is very, very unlikely to know that's what you're doing. They're expecting you to be setting the tone, and you are. You're setting the tone of the campaign, giving them an idea of what to expect, but the best way you can blend in foreshadowing in those early times is to make it flavor, to describe things and settings that are going on in the world that seem innocuous. They seem like they're just part of the flavor, but like this girl getting kidnapped, realizing, yes, it led to the flavor that this is a bustling, exciting, crazy city, and no one can completely have their finger on exactly what's going on. That was the flavor I was trying to get across. But the fact that it was a foreshadowed plot element that would come up later, you had no way of knowing that at the beginning when you're so focused on what character am I playing? Let me develop a personality, maybe a voice, and interacting with the other players and kind of really feeling what we are as a party in the early days.
Yes. So one of the things that I think early on can be a powerful tool of foreshadowing is anything that makes itself seem out of place. And I think of early things like if you watch a movie, you know that bad things are going to start happening when the weather changes, right? When the rain starts coming down, the music in the background sort of shifts to something a little more ominous. But I think capturing elements like that aren't even necessarily hints about what's going to happen, but they still they play on your mind as, okay, something's different here. So yeah, you might be enjoying yourself in a tavern, as a lot of early games tend to kick off, but then all of a sudden wind starts buffeting the shutters of the window and rain is pouring outside. It changes the mood.
It does. And now you have a wonderful element that set the tone. And maybe that's just what it is. Maybe you're just setting the tone with that, but maybe there's something else going on. I mean, it could be as obvious as some sort of magical weather manipulation, and now the party needs to go figure out what's going on with that, toward foreshadowing a major tragedy. You know, rain obviously is a thematic element that's used to foreshadow sadness or tragedy. So you can use it in a lot of different ways, but I'm talking more specifically in there's a fight between two characters in the tavern in the example that you mentioned. And it seems like, oh, this is a rough and tumble place. And yeah, you're getting that message across. But maybe the personal vendetta those two characters had was over a disagreement about something. One of them was working for someone who was connected to the overall plot story, and the other one was working against them. And you later meet the person who was working against them and learn why there was a fight, why that was important. And then it ties you much more into the story.
Yeah, I like elements like that. I also like, one of my favorite tools for foreshadowing or dropping hints is something that players tend to overlook a lot, and it's that overhearing a conversation. So they might hear somebody at the table in the tavern next to them mention something about food shortage in the next kingdom or whatever. May not mean anything to them at the time, but then later on, as they're actually engrossed in national politics, that food shortage or whatever was causing that food shortage can become a more prominent piece of your story.
That's exactly right. And I think the best campaigns are those that feel deep, that feel engaging, and that the world feels alive. And the way you do that is by letting the players be aware of things that are going on in the world that they are not themselves involved in, especially if you have plans in your story for them eventually to be involved in, dropping those early hints as flavor. And then the players feel like they have that total sandbox freedom to pursue all of that, which is exactly what you wanted them to do in the first place.
Yeah, and I think you make a very good point about saying if they're going to be involved in it eventually, you should have some early on connection. It doesn't need to be direct. It doesn't need to be blatant, but it should be there. There should be some thread that you can see is woven through the entirety of your story from the very beginning.
That's exactly right. And I think you can't really overdo this. So in the current Tolis campaign that I'm running, I actually made a list of a little over a dozen foreshadowing elements before I ever ran session 1 that I wanted to. And I was checking them off in my notebook, and I'm like, okay, this has been revealed. This hasn't been. And by session 3, I had all 12 of them. I think there's one that I decided not to go with, but the other 11 all were revealed to the party. And it's way too much for a first level party to possibly get involved in, which is exactly the point. They need to feel that the world is continuing without them. The world is living, breathing, and has things to go on long before they started the campaign. And while their characters, maybe at low level, don't have much impact on the world, as they continue to grow in power and ability and knowledge and in depth of their relationships in the world, and they start to be able to make changes, it's going to make them feel that much more meaningful and impactful as the campaign continues, when they can really deal with some of these things that seemed like just flavor in the early days of the game.
Yeah, you mentioned making checklists, and that's something, I mean, I know you've read my book, but we have a whole section in there that talks about that in terms of plot twists. So foreshadowing is sort of like the path of a plot twist, right? Because in order to have an effective plot twist, you have to foreshadow.
Exactly. And throw them off. I mean, and again, the best plot twists are the ones you don't expect. And we talk about red herrings in that as well. You can foreshadow things that are very, very direct, and you should, because it makes your plot twists less anticipatable. And when you don't know a plot twist is coming, that makes the most effective plot twist.
Well, I think another interesting, just while we're sitting here talking about this, I had this flash in my mind of Star Wars, right? So I'm thinking about the Galactic Empire, and then you watch the second trilogy first, because that's the one that was produced first. But then you go back and you get to have all these really interesting foreshadowing elements that you already know what's going to happen with them as a viewer, but you kind of get to see how they are taking place, like Emperor Palpatine taking control of the Senate and saying, oh yeah, I'll give back power eventually when this is settled. But you already know he's not giving back power. So I think that's kind of an interesting way of looking at it, where you kind of see, if you were building that as the writer, as the director, yeah, I have this big thing that's going to happen. But when I go forward to the point where the players actually are, what are the elements I can drop in now?
That's exactly right. And actually, you touched on what I think is one of the most fun things for me as a GM, is to know where the story is going and know from the beginning. So if you're telling that story of Emperor Palpatine, and the players have no idea what he's going to become, but you know what he's going to become. Right. And that makes it fascinating to run. And you can play with that, and you can foreshadow that by just, mentioning something casual that seems offhand. Is the Emperor has a strange glint in his eye that seems hungry for a moment, but then you look back and know it was never there to begin with.
Right. So, and obviously Star Wars is a unique example because most things aren't built with the second chapter first and then jumping forward, but it is a usable story and world building method. I mean, you could, and I've always thought about this, but I think the mechanics of it would be really hard to pull off. You could run a game that was a prequel.
It's true. Oftentimes that's done with like the family or like the parentage of the characters. I mean, obviously it's easier to run the sequel game with the children of the characters after a campaign concludes. But running a prequel would be possible, but you'd have to plan the original campaign from the beginning. And the struggle is you'd have to put enough work into it and have enough dedication to have the same players play in both games. So you're talking about at least a year to year and a half commitment at minimum to be able to do a prequel type game. But even if you're not going to that level of extreme, still having it a general idea of where the game's going gives you that ability to foreshadow elements without even having to go to that full level.
What about this idea, though? Try this one on for size. You don't run a prequel game, you run a prequel session. Okay. So session 1 is with pre-generated characters. You hand them all to your players and say, here's who you're playing for this session. And they just play out the big fight that the last adventuring party failed at, is still connected to this story your characters are going to play through eventually, but it kind of gives them this taste of what's coming in this world and what's past in this world already. And this is where our characters are now jumping in with no idea of all of that, but your players have that a little bit.
What I really like about that is that allows you to be very direct. The best foreshadowing generally is subtle, so you don't actually realize it's foreshadowing. But in that particular example, I mean, in your Star Wars example, obviously everyone knows by the time, the first 3 episodes of Star Wars come out that Emperor Palpatine's the bad guy and he's going to become the emperor of the Empire. But the characters at that point don't know that. With a method like that, even an introductory session, in that example, you can be very direct and actually reveal things that the new characters don't know. Mm-hmm. But it's like looking behind the screen. That's an interesting way to give the players a taste of what it really is to be a GM and to write that story, because you can reveal some big secrets of the game, maybe not all of them, but some big secrets of where things are going to end up or what the real enemy is, but then make it clear to the players the characters don't know that, but the players will secretly be like, oh no, what's going to happen?
Mm-hmm. So I think one thing that you and I both do when we run a game is we're very good at pulling things off the cuff, right? So players make a decision that's going to change the way that I had planned the game to go. That's fine. That's what they want to do. Let's go with it. Let's figure out a different way to navigate the path the way that I wanted to. Or if it doesn't work with my world anymore, then it changes. That's okay. What I think would be really fun in a scenario like that, where you have a whole session that's foreshadowing through characters that they're not actually playing, is you could actually then say, I'm not going to decide how this final confrontation is going to go until I see what they did in this first session.
And then you can build your story based upon the results of how that goes.
Right.
And that honestly is one of the most fun for me of collaborative storytelling in general, even outside of a specific setup for a campaign like that. Not knowing how a fight's going to turn out, not knowing how a particular encounter is going to be resolved, not knowing what direction a player is going to choose. We have the flexibility between sessions to kind of design around player choice. And, you can generally lead the players where you're going with with the foreshadowing elements, but the most fun is they're going to go the direction they want to. And the directions that they go, you can build around. And the directions they don't go, you can build around as well. Because the things you may have foreshadowed, the hooks that you've dropped that they haven't latched onto, those continue to grow and develop and change in the world. And then when you bring it back up later, they're like, oh my gosh, I forgot about that.
Mm-hmm. So what about, here's another idea I just had is, how much fun would it be to build a game where all of the foreshadowing took place in the characters' backstories that they wrote themselves? So if you take their backstories and all the elements that they had in their backstories and then find a way to weave those into whatever your big problem is, so that from the very beginning, they have foreshadowing that goes back before they roll their dice the first time.
We'll be right back.
Hey, Cyclithids, if you love the Dungeons, Dragons, and Psychology podcast and want to help keep it alive, there are a ton of ways you can support the show. Join us on Patreon for exclusive content like NPC character sheets, early access to new products, and even first looks at DM's Assistant app. You can also grab gaming-inspired merch on the Etsy shop, Games for Games, or pick up one of my books, The Player's Handbook to Real Life, or Session Zero, the DMG to writing great campaigns in any system. And even if financial support isn't in the cards for you, you can still help by sharing this show, leaving reviews, or introducing new players to our community. Links are always in the show notes, and thank you for being the heart of our adventure.
Wow. That's compelling. It's funny you mentioned that. There was a campaign that my wife and I ran, Last Harbingers, that you played in, that we did something very, very similar. We didn't start with the player's background, but we actually took the story of Aurodin in the Pathfinder world, and we took that story of the death of that divinity, and we went back through the history, and we tried to explain in our own campaign why every event that took place in history, every meaningful event, was actually tied into this overarching death story. And that ended up being somewhat unique as a time traveling campaign, with the party going gradually further and further and further back in time to eventually meeting Aurodin before he became a god and helping him go through all of that. But that was something that, because of the way that the campaign was built, when you were able to actually dive in and play with that element.
Yeah, that was an interesting one because it did something that was a little bit different from like the prequel idea, which was almost like a flashback idea. So we had a starting point in the future, and we kept moving further and further back into sort of playable flashbacks of a god's life, as all the way back to before he was divine at all.
Which, when you were talking about foreshadowing and, going backwards, that's actually a really, really interesting dynamic, because that's basically what happened. You guys know what comes later, but what came before?
Yeah, that is, and it was a really fun and unique way to play, because it's sort of turning the linear timeline on its head.
And obviously, those are extreme examples, and it still can be done in a very, very direct fashion. So the listeners don't have to go to the extreme of doing their plots necessarily from the back, going back in time or going back to a pre-session. But that's a very, very unique element that could certainly be used to foreshadow with, and actually, I think very effectively, because the best foreshadowing is the ones the players never really suspect. The best thing that they would never suspect is before their characters that they plan on playing for the campaign have really even begun.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said about the sort of foreshadowing where when you put it out in front of the characters, they don't pick up on it. But later on, they remember that element.
Exactly.
And they can see the threads that ran all the way through.
Exactly. And of course, that's the common and most effective, in my opinion, version of foreshadowing. But to your point, it's fun to foreshadow in a way where the players know what's really going on, but their characters are clueless.
Yeah. And that always does get into the whole kind of metagame concept. But I think for the most part, I don't usually run into that as a struggle. Like, I think there's so much concern out there. And if you read a lot of D&D blogs and things like that, there's always this worry about metagaming. Maybe people have had big problems with it in their games, but I think in my games, if you remind people that it's something their characters don't know, they're usually pretty great about making their actions fit what their character would do.
It's absolutely true. You do have to be somewhat aware of the maturity of your group, though. In a group with younger players, it's harder to maintain that player versus character knowledge separation, just because of the how many years they played the game and how well they understand the tabletop role-playing kind of a format. You get into a more senior group who's been playing together 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and it's easier to understand that dynamic. And really, I guess in my opinion, once as a player you've experienced an incredible story once or twice, you're willing to suspend your disbelief, take a step back and say, okay, yep, I don't know that in character, so I'm just going to ignore it entirely, while still secretly being thrilled as a player as the story develops of what's going to happen.
Well, I think, yeah, our group is a pretty good example of that, because we are pretty quick at checking each other if something's said or something mentioned and we don't know it in character. Everybody in the group's pretty quick about being like, oh, wait, we don't know that in character. Don't act on that information.
Sure. And without getting too far into the metagaming topic, there's obviously ways to say, okay, what I'm about to say is not in character. And obviously, if you can keep most of the discussion in character, I think that's really, really beneficial, having the characters discuss situations in character rather than out of character. It may take a little bit more time at the game table, but it creates a much more coherency to the story, and it gets rid of that dichotomy between do I understand in character or do I not?
Yeah, and there's some groups out there, and I've listened to other podcasts where they have a very strict anything that's said at the table is said in character ruling. That can be tricky.
Sure.
Because sometimes I say some really off the wall stuff just for a laugh. And then if I had my character say that all the time, that would be problematic.
And unfortunately, that doesn't cater to the casual gamers, out there. And there's enough casual gamers, and I think it's nice to be able to incorporate players of who are approaching the game not as veterans, not as people who is their primary passion, but just to spend time in their social circle, like you mentioned in your book Session Zero. Those folks are important as well, and you don't want to necessarily overshadow them by making it too serious.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Because some people are just there to spend time with their friends and they don't necessarily want to be involved with the role play aspect. But that doesn't mean that their contributions to the game can't be just as significant as anybody else's.
That's true, but actually those are the players that I'm most intrigued to foreshadow with. The players who really haven't found that moment of drive that really ties them into the story, that makes them fall in love with tabletop role-playing. It's those casual gamers that I want to understand a little bit more about their story, what they're trying to get out of the game, beyond just hanging out with their friends, and to foreshadow specifically elements that they are involved in, without necessarily forcing them into the main plot of the game, but foreshadowing elements that are relevant to their character and their part of the story.
So you can kind of make the story move around them so that they're, even if they're not directing their character's action, they're still moving along as part of it.
Exactly. And again, like any good element, you want to use it in moderation. But when that foreshadowing is tied around those characters carefully, it gives you an opportunity to involve those players in the game in a way that they may not currently be involved in.
Okay, so more on terms of foreshadowing, can you give me any elements that aren't spoilers to your game, but you think make for good foreshadowing?
Oh my gosh, so many different things can be. I mean, anything is foreshadowing if the players don't know what's really going on. And if you're doing good narration, when you're setting a scene in a particular area and you don't explain the whys, which most of the time a good GM shouldn't explain, well, this is happening because of this. Mm-hmm. You don't need to explain why it's happening. Let the players speculate. That's part of the fun as being a player, is trying to figure it out, trying to figure out the whys. Just like in the real world, we don't really know why the people around us necessarily do the things they do, particularly as you get into the bigger scene, global events and stuff. We don't know the whys necessarily of the human decisions involved in that process. The characters typically aren't going to know, especially in the lower levels in the beginning there as well. So when you know where the overall story is heading, it is very, very easy to work backwards from how the decisions of the main plot are affecting the game. You got to look at the high level all the way down to the low level. So if someone is in power, is trying to achieve something dangerous or important, maybe they're going to muster the army. And maybe the first way you foreshadow mustering the army is in a peaceful community, you have a higher ranking member of the guard chastising and reprimanding people for lesser guards for minor infractions. And that seems meaningless. It seems flavor, but it leads on to, oh my gosh, maybe the guard is going to become more important. There's going to be a conflict going on. So the best foreshadowing is just you knowing what's happening and thinking about how the players are going to see those more wide sweeping events from a very, very, very narrow angle of view. So giving them the opportunity to see that without any explanation as to why it's going on.
Yeah, I think what you said a few moments ago about giving them the what, but not giving them the why is kind of the whole idea of foreshadowing, right? You're saying, oh, yes, the tavern looks particularly empty today and people are in a somber mood. You don't have to say why.
Exactly.
But there's definitely a mood shift there that they're not used to in game. Something is different.
And the players have the opportunity to investigate that or not at their leisure. And if they decide not to investigate it, the reason it was somber that day remains the same. And their lack of investigation may cause things to happen in the same way them investigating would cause things to happen. And that just creates that greater depth of the world. At the end of the day, because you know where the story is heading, both in the individual chapter you may be telling as well as the overall campaign story, you can continue to tie in elements of how things that are not happening on stage with the PCs are being seen through the eyes of both, player characters and the other characters that exist in your world. And because they have that very, very narrow mind, it's not like every day is a bright, sunshiny day with nothing going on. It becomes a situation where there's a difference every day because things are actually changing and in the world. And they can feel that the world truly is alive and breathing because of that.
So I have to think of some of the best examples I've ever seen of really effectively played out foreshadowing elements. And I think in cinema, one of the best ones that's ever been done is in the movie The Sixth Sense, right? When you watch it all the way through the first time, maybe you've got this really spectacular foreshadowing brain and you figured out that he was dead. But I don't believe anybody who tells me that they figured it out before they saw it the first time unless they read a spoiler of it somewhere.
Not a chance.
But definitely when you go back and watch it the second time, you see all of those hints laid out before you, and they make so much sense. That's the kind of foreshadowing I want to see in a game, where you get to the end, you have the plot twist, and then you go, oh, wow, she was really having dinner with herself. He wasn't there having a conversation with her. That kind of thing.
Exactly. And there's so many examples of that. I think Fight Club is another wonderful example of foreshadowing through that, where you don't actually realize that, the main character, Tyler Durden, is both of the main characters the whole time.
Right.
And when you go through the story the first time, you're kind of confused. When it does a really, really good job of going back and showing you scenes that had happened and what was really going on in those scenes. But the cool thing about doing this in the element of a tabletop role-playing game is there's other players at the table. It's fun as a GM to be properly foreshadowing these elements, and then when the big reveals happen, be they a plot twist or just revealing things that are obvious, that should have been obvious, that the players didn't realize, it gives the players between sessions an opportunity to really engage with the campaign by discussing these ideas together back and forth. And it's like having a novel you both read and want to share it. But even the best novels I've ever read, I can spend 15 minutes talking to a friend about them. The best games I played in will go weeks without talking about anything else.
That's true. Okay, well, that was an excellent discussion. We've got some fun and unique tricks of the trade planned for you now, so let's get right into that. So on today's Tricks of the Trade, we're going to go back to our Tricks of the Trade from last week, and we're going to flesh out one of our ideas and give a little bit of ideas about how you can foreshadow for that concept. So Dustin is going to go first. He's going to tell you first about the idea from last week, and then we're going to flesh it out.
So my favorite idea from last week was a powerful immortal was killed a century ago, but has delayed death using a powerful charged artifact that allows him to delay his fate. But the artifact is running short on power, and thus the immortal is running short on time. So this idea has a lot of dynamic to it. So without telling you as a listener exactly what's going on in the story, I'll give you an example or 5 of foreshadowing elements that I would use, and then I'll explain what the party would eventually discover based upon investigations of various elements. Earlier on in today's session, we talked about a guard captain who is reprimanding people for seemingly insignificant events like scuffed boots, or, what side of their belt they may carry their sword on, or, for a wrinkle in their uniform or something like that. That foreshadowing a war that might be coming. There could be news spreading of a massacre at the royal court without an explanation as to what was going on there. Jewelers in town begin complaining of a recent difficulty acquiring diamonds for their gems. Several well-known nobles find pieces of valuable jewelry happens to be stolen. And a necromancer who had received a life sentence has somehow gone missing from his cell. And clerics of the god of prophecy begin to recant their previous predictions of a coming apocalypse, saying there was nefarious magic involved. Well, what's really going on here is this immortal got a hold of this artifact without actually being a magic user or a wizard or a sorcerer of any kind. In fact, not having any idea how the artifact worked, this immortal didn't even know that the artifact was running out of power. But as the impact of this started to become relevant, he started to be terrified of the end of his life and started to take actions to try to figure out what was really going on. The first thing he did, of course, is try to get information as to what caused this artifact to happen. Well, through his research, he discovered that a powerful necromancer currently imprisoned under the king's orders in the dungeon under the palace was the only person who could tell him anything. Unfortunately, per the king's order, no one can speak with this necromancer for fear of the dangerous knowledge he has. So this immortal first undergoes the process of co-opting the royal court, figuring out who's on his side, who's not on his side, hiring assassins to deal with those, but we don't want it to look like an assassination. No, that's too obvious. Let's have a gala or a ball and a massacre take place where just those who don't support my agenda are the ones who end up getting killed. And then the king himself, now he's a threat. Well, okay, now that I've started this process, I can masquerade as him because everyone else in the royal court that opposed me is gone. Now that I can act as the king with impunity, I can get a hold of this necromancer. Oh, it seems like my artifact is powered by souls and I need a terrible catastrophe. Okay, so how do I achieve that? War. How do I get a war going? Well, okay, let's figure this out. The gods of prophecy had been talking about a coming apocalypse. Well, the people can't think that there's actually a coming apocalypse because if they do, then they're going to resist this or there's going to be heroes that are going to get in my way. Okay, so now we got to figure out how we can hold them accountable or threaten maybe members of their families so they recant these previous predictions. Oh, but in order to store all this soul energy from these murders on the battlefield, I need diamonds. Gosh, I need to get a hold of all of them. All the ones from the mines, all the ones from valuable pieces. Now I'm hiring thieves. So you can see how all these disparate elements that don't seem connected at all can tie into the actions of really a single NPC villain who is trying to achieve a very specific goal, but it's a complicated process to do so. So they seem very, very disconnected, and the players can have a chance to really investigate lots of different elements. And maybe they go to the diamond mines and find that it's not that they ran short. It's just all of the shipments have been stolen before they've been shipped into town without any explanation.
So Dustin's gone ahead and given you guys an entire campaign idea that you can take from start to finish and build a whole world around. And it's got all of the elements you want in there with all the foreshadowing. But tell me, where would you put different pieces of that foreshadowing in terms of your characters playing through it? Like, what's the first piece you would give them and what's the last piece you would give them?
I would probably start out with the most subtle and gradually build to the more dramatic elements. So in the examples that I gave, the jewelers having a shortage of diamonds would probably be the very first thing because it seems weird. Why would the players care? They're just going to hear about this. And then maybe the next thing is the guard captain, reprimanding their subordinate officers for minor things, which seems kind of out of character because there hasn't been a war in centuries and it's a peaceful area. And then maybe the thefts. And now maybe the players are a high enough level that they're getting like, I'm going to investigate. Can I try to recover this stolen relic? And maybe they recover it and the diamonds are pried out and missing. Isn't that interesting?
Well, and that definitely lends into the idea that as they progress and they become more powerful, obviously they find more powerful items, magical items. It can certainly affect the characters a lot more as they go along. Yes, maybe it's just something they heard early on. There's a diamond shortage or all the shipments are being stolen. But later on, as they start to acquire these things, and they also now have thieves trying to get their diamonds, or they have party deaths or character deaths, and they can't get the required diamond dust that they need to raise them. So they're having to resort to more nefarious methods, perhaps, of bringing people back from the dead. It can really play a heavy hand in the foreshadowing as you go along.
That's exactly right. And that's the whole idea, is letting these elements of the game shape player choice, that they seem like they're just they're obstacles the player has to overcome without realizing the real consequence, the real rationale. And that's how the best foreshadowing is. They're like, okay, this player died. I need to get the 5,000 gold piece diamond or whatever it may be in the setting you're playing in to go ahead and bring them back from the dead. I can't find that anywhere. I'm having to go on an epic quest just to get an item that I have plenty of money for, but I still can't find available anywhere. And that just seems like, on the surface, it seems like the DM maybe being petty, trying to say, oh, nope, you can't find him. I want that player to be dead. But as the party starts to discover the real reason why that is, it's very interesting. Well, it's not just this diamond. All diamonds are hard to come by.
Right.
Why? And then, you go further along, and then maybe they later in the campaign, when they have access to magical resources, they learn of this necromancer missing from the prison. And this is something that is a national secret, basically, that's kept completely under wraps, because it was known that this necromancer possessed this horrible information, and that was the one thing the Immortal made certain no one could find out about until the players are high enough level to use magical resources to learn that little piece of the puzzle, and maybe or maybe not understand the significance. And you can continue to add these foreshadowing elements, and eventually, with good players, probably before you're ready for it, they start to put the pieces together, and that's the moment of the big reveal where they realize what the story's actually about. And if you've done it well, not only does it make perfect sense, everything you've laid out from the very, very beginning, now you have the ultimate investment of your players, and they really want to see how this comes together.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dustin. I appreciate you joining me on this episode. We'll have you again very soon. As always, please check out my book, Session Zero, The DMG to Writing Great Campaigns in Any System. You can find it on Amazon. There's also a link in the show notes. Next week, we're going to be talking with economist and numbers man Joseph Henry about stat generation methods. Please tune into that. It's likely to be more of a debate than it is a conversation, but it should be a lot of fun. We will see you next session.